Hey guys, Matt here from EBMX. Today I'm going to run you guys through how to install our controller kits using the ASI BAC controllers. I'm going to give you a quick overview of what comes in your guys' kit, talk to you about the tools that you need to install it, and then we're going to get into that install process. So first up, this is pretty much everything you're going to get. Right now we've got a BAC8000. If you have a BAC4000, the only difference is you're going to have a smaller or a bigger top mount. So this is the top mount for the BAC4000. We've got an 8000 here, so we're going to be using these ones and just ignoring that bracket for now. First thing let's jump into is the box that comes. So this box is going to be your APT display. So this is a display that has all the power modes and lets you adjust some of the functionality of the bike as you're riding. When you open it up, you're going to find that it's got connected with this cord. This is not needed, it's just something that comes in these kits, so just ask you guys to, first thing, just disconnect that or it'll be confusing later on. We don't need this part anymore. Inside of here, the rest of it, you're going to have your actual APT unit itself, and then you're going to have the power selector here. So this is how you're going to turn on power to your bike. After you flip the key, you're going to hold this down, and then you're going to be able to select modes here, and I'll run through later the functions of this mode button here as we set the programming up. This cord is just going to plug into the cord that's on the harness, and we'll show you that as we get to the install as well. There's a little bag inside of here with some small hardware that's used to install the clamps and just some rubber to fit depending on the bar size you guys have, 28.9 or 31.8. Throw this back in for now. All right, now the controller itself here, it's really important we get these mounted in an upright fashion such that the plugs are at the top of the controller, not at the bottom of the controller. When they're down at the bottom, it's just easier for water and other things to get in the system, and we really want to avoid that everywhere that we can. So these are the newer controller mounts that we have. These are the older version of them. They both work, just the newer version has a little area cut out for the plugs at the top, whereas the older version, you might just need to use a couple of these little washers that are in here to help pack this up so that your plugs, the clips on the top of your plugs, will snap into place here without any resistance. We've got our phase wires, so these are just going to be the extensions of the phase wires off of the motor. So you've got blue, green, and yellow. When you guys take apart the motor and take off your stock controller, you're going to see these same colors listed on those wires. You just need to know where they match up on this controller. So I've written it down here. W goes to blue, V goes to yellow, and U goes to green. So that's the order that they're going to go into. Here's your harness that's going to come. This is what it looks like. There's only two plugs that can go together here, one big, one small. One thing that you guys may want to do, depending on where you ride, is add some dielectric grease. I'm going to show you the process of putting that in because it's not just slather it all over. There's a pretty specific way to do that when we do the install. And then we've got some heat shrink that's included in the bag with some of our hardware. Now this heat shrink is just going to be used to go over the tops of the phase wire connections for the extensions when they're added on. So I'm just going to set this stuff aside and I'm going to grab a controller that's all put together. So this is what your controller is going to look like. This being the top, this being the bottom. This is how it's all plugged together, and these plugs are going to end up sitting up like this to connect to the stock plugs. And this guy's going to run up the top, connect to your display, and you just make sure you read the note that's on this one other wire coming out of here. It does have a little red bit. It's a green wire, and this is a ground wire, so make sure this goes to the negative terminal on here. So now we've run through all that, let's get into taking off the stock controller, and then we'll talk through how to put all this stuff on to our bike. All right, we've got our stock bike here now. We're going to start disassembling all the pieces we need to take off and the motor controller and get ready for putting on all the new parts onto our new bike. So the first thing you're going to do with your bike, take your keys, undo the side latch. Now, really important, make sure we flip our breaker off before you do any modifications or adjustments on your bike. So flipping that off, then you're going to come and you're disconnect your two plugs that are here off of your battery. And we're just going to pull this battery out. Set it off to the side. It's not needed for now. All right, once we've done that, since I'm standing up here, we'll just go and we'll take off our old display. So as I showed you guys that other display before with the APT, that's going to replace this stock display here. So just need a Phillips head screwdriver, take these two screws out of here, All right, once we've got that guy off, we can just leave it disconnected here. There may be a few little of these clips. You guys can just take those off, holding the cable routing together. And the first thing we're gonna do on the top of the bike here now is take off the plate, the 2 screws on the cover where your key was. So the first thing we're gonna do on the top of the bike is we're gonna take off this cover where the key barrel is housed. So just a 4mm Allen key, take these 2 guys off. This will get us into where all the plugs are connected, and we're gonna need to disconnect a few of those. So once you've popped those off, this guy should just pull right back, sort of wiggle it till it comes out, and then pull it out, set it to the side. I suggest just putting these screws right back in so you don't lose them, and they hold their place here. Now you're gonna need to follow these wires. There's 2 of them coming from your existing switch here, and they're gonna come all the way down inside of this group of wires down here. So when you pull these out to have a look at them, you're gonna see a whole bunch of different plugs in here. Trace the wires that have come from this display. You're gonna see there's 2 different plugs. Take those out. So there's one. Trace the next one down and find that one. And here's the second one here. Once we've disconnected those, we should be able to pull them out through, and we should be able to take this guy off. And this is not going to be needed with the rest of the kit that we're going to install. Another really important thing is disconnecting the brake sensors. So on your stock bike, you're going to have brake sensors that are connected inside of a little rubber gland that sits inside of here. We want to make sure these disconnect, because when we have our new controller on, it's not going to use these. They won't be, they won't do anything on the bike. And also, if you were to leave them on and then you somehow got water inside your controller, you could short out and your brakes could turn into throttles, which is something we want nobody to do. So disconnect these. They're really kind of difficult to get out from in the brakes, and since they're not going to be needed anymore, I would suggest just going ahead and clipping these off, and then you can pull the wires out. Just make sure you're clipping off the electrical cords, not your hydraulic lines here. It's the bottom 2, and you're going to pull these out. So again, these no longer needed now. Now that we've got all that stuff disconnected from the top, we're going to start disconnecting the motor controller down below. There's a few bolts on the side of the motor controller here. Those 2, I would just suggest just keep everything in a pile on the ground here. Make it easy so you can keep track of all the different nuts and bolts you take off. And the other side, same thing. There's a little plastic guard that sits over right below your guys' horn. So we're going to get that off, and then we'll get to the top 2 mounts for the motor controller. So take these out. 1. So once we've got the controller loose here, we just need to disconnect the rest of the main harness that runs up. So we're going to take off these bolts either side, right in the middle of the frame, and that'll allow us to open up this middle area here and get into the harness. Just keep track of these bolts. They're a little different than most of the rest of them. They're a little bit longer. I normally just set them on the inside of the battery compartment area, just to make sure I don't mix them up. Once we've done that, you can pull from the inside, and now you can access all of your harness inside of the bike quite easily. You're going to disconnect the 2 plugs that run down to the motor controller, the 2 big ones, and there's 1 small one. So there's 3 of them in total, and disconnect all 3 of those. There's a triangle one and then 2 larger ones. There's 1, 2, that's the 3rd one. Okay, so now that's disconnected. Our controller is loose there. Now we've got to get the phase cables disconnected at the bottom of the controller. To make this a little bit easier, if you want, you can go ahead and you can loosen up and lower down your bash guard. That might help you out. If you have an Allen key that has the rounded bit on it, you can normally reach it into here and make do. And now we've got the phase cables disconnected. We'll just go in for the positive and negative cables here. We won't be using any of these bolts that we're taking off that are holding in the power cables or the phase cables, so we can just go ahead and discard those off to the side or wherever they aren't needed. All right, guys, now that we've got the motor controller completely taken out with the harness that was with it, we got access to all of our phase cables down in the bottom and our power cables. The last thing we need to take off the stock bike is we need to take off the tilt sensor bracket. We're going to put it back on, but we need to remove the actual tilt sensor just to leave room for the harness that we're going to put to go on the inside of there. So a little awkward to get to, but there's just two Allen keys or Allen bolts that hold this in. So just go ahead and loosen those, take them out. This is another one of the sensors, just like the other sensors on the bike that we've taken off, the handlebar ones, that when the new motor controller is on, this tilt sensor actually won't have any function on the bike and it will not work. So you're not going to miss anything having it removed. So this is the tilt sensor bracket with the tilt sensor. It's a white plug. Just go ahead, squeeze and disconnect. Now the tilt sensor is on a piece of rubber and you just need to work its way off. There we are. And we'll hold onto this bracket. This is going to be used when we start installing things, putting the harness inside of it on the next bike. So let's move on to the EBMX bike and let's start building this back up. All right, we'll get our bike set up and get ready to start installing everything now. So I've got all the parts laid out on the ground here like I showed you guys before, and we're just going to start taking these pieces and getting them installed on the bike. All right, the first thing that we need to do is put on our phase wire extensions here. So we've got all the same colors that we had on here before. We're just going to need to take these ones off and go ahead and install them. And then we're going to use our heat shrink to get them all the way in place. Just make sure when you guys are moving these bolts around, you've got a lock washer that needs to sit on top of a flat washer, all right? So to join these together, you're going to go into the bag of goodies that you got sent, and I'm just going to lay all these out on the ground here. It's easier to find what we're after. Just double check your guys' heat shrink when it comes out of the pack, because these nuts and bolts just love to stay inside of it. So get the 3 small pieces and keep them to one side. Take your big piece and just set it off to the side there for now. So what you're looking for is, we've got some nylock nuts, and we've got the bolts to go with them, and then we're going to have a washer on each one as well. So what we're going to do, we'll start with the blue. What I would do to make it easy to line up onto the controller is just keep the blue end that's actually labeled blue further away, and make sure that we're connecting up to the blue one here. You're going to go ahead. Doesn't matter which goes on top of the other. So whatever's convenient for you to do, just putting these through, one doesn't have to be on top of another. You're going to put your bolt, you're going to put your washer, and you're going to put your nut. And just put it hand tight until you hit the nylon there. And we're just going to get all 3 of them prepped like this. All right, so we're just going to need to grab a 10 mil socket and an Allen key to get these tightened up. When you tighten them up, we just want to make sure they face nice and straight. That's going to be easiest to make sure we get the bends that we need in the cables. So when you're tightening these, just make sure that we tighten them nice and straight. And after we get these tightened up, we're going to grab our heat gun and those 3 pieces of heat shrink that came in that little kit, and we're going to get those to cover over the top of these, make sure they stay in place as well as protected so they can't touch anything else. All right, now we're ready for our heat shrink. We've got these 3 pieces. Just go ahead, should fit right over the top, and slide them all the way down. Just try to center that nut and bolt in the middle of where the heat shrink is going to sit for when it tightens up. Kind of feel with your hands where it should be, where the nut and bolt are in the middle there. So you're gonna grab your heat gun and go ahead and heat these up. This is a mastic heat shrink as well, so it's kind of glue lined. So just make sure you get enough heat in it that you see it tighten down fully on either side of these phase wires. Sometimes it takes a fair amount of heat to get there, but you want to make sure it will close down all of these gaps. You just got to make sure you keep the heat on it long enough. Keep moving the wire back and forth. You should conform right around these nuts and bolts here as well. All right, once we've got those nice and tight in place, we'll set the heat gun down for a minute. We're still going to use it later on to cover a few connectors, but we're ready to start getting our controller into place. So we want to get the controller mounted up to those same colors that we had there before, making sure, again, the orientation here is the plugs are going to be on the top, and these bottom brackets are down on the bottom. These bottom brackets are going to sit up to these holes here that have already threads on the inside. They're going to sit on the outside of those and get bolted through. And these top ones are going to sit on the same connection that we have on the stock controller, which is actually part of this inner mount here, which is what was holding that tilt sensor. So these are the actual holes on the tilt sensor that are going to be used. So probably need to actually just get this tilt sensor in there first. And when we do that, we want to make sure that we pass through this harness through that area. So this is going to bolt back onto our inner bracket inside of here, and we're going to make sure that we get our harness inside like that. Okay, get these nice and nipped down. Once we've got these tightened down in place, before we can put the controller in, we're going to need to make sure that this piece of the frame is actually put back into place. There's a couple metal clips that hold the threaded sides, the threaded inserts. Just make sure when we're pushing things back together inside of here that those are lining up. Sometimes they have a tendency to pop off. We can also go ahead and take this main Sauron connector here, and this is no longer going to be used on any of the aftermarket batteries, or once you've completed a bypass and you're using the stock battery. So we're going to tuck this away. Before we do that real quick, we're just going to put a little bit of heat shrink over the top to make sure no water or anything gets inside of there. We've provided you guys with a fairly decent size of this really large heat shrink. We're going to go ahead and just cut that. I'm going to cut that in half here to put over this plug. And fit over the top of this plug. It's a little bit tight on here, but just do your best to get it worked over the top. And then go ahead, grab that heat gun again, and we'll just heat this up and seal this off. Okay. The heat shrink won't close all the way. It does get quite warm, so at the very end, you're just going to need to go ahead and squeeze with your fingers. You can wear gloves if it's too hot, but this will just make sure it's actually sealed down all the way through, like that, and that's now capped off there. Water and anything can't get inside of there. So when we're going to go ahead and push this back in, we can take this connector and push it down into the cavity in the back, so we're only leaving our power leads exposed. Make sure these clips are in place and nothing else is in the way, and push this into place. If you look from the sides, you can see when those holes are going to line up. You're going to go ahead and grab those longer screws we mentioned before and get these locked in place here. One side, hop over to the other side here and get this one in place. All right, once we've got this connected on here, we're going to get our harness top plugs connected in with the plugs that are in the harness. So that's why we removed that tilt sensor. So we had stuck these up. What we want to do is we just want to pull down those two plugs that we need from the stock harness. When you pull them out, you'll see which goes to which. So this is the first one. This is normally the easy one to put together. Push till it clicks. And then the next one, this one can be a little more difficult sometimes to put in. It will go, don't overly force it. Just double check and make sure that the tips of all of your connectors are nice and straight. If you guys are having trouble putting this together, the odds are is that it's not lined up internally. So it should go together just like that and like that. Then we've got this long connection that's going to go up to the APT display. This one we just need to route up through. It's going to come out the top here. Just going to need to find it as it comes through and help route it up the top. It's going to come out with this other wire up here and go to the display. So we can just tuck it up out of the way there for now and go back down to the rest of the harness. So now, before we go ahead and plug these connectors onto our motor controller, I'm going to put some dielectric grease on these. We highly suggest that if you guys are riding anywhere wet, dielectric grease is a great tool to use to keep any sort of moisture and water out of the controllers, as well as making sure they're mounted upright like this. When we use dielectric grease, You don't want to actually just go ahead and put it into the connectors. It's not meant for that. The correct way to use it is to try to get it on the outside of the connectors to seal them off. Dielectric grease is non-conductive, so putting that inside of an electrical connection is not what we want to do. So what I normally do is start letting it out of the tube and going along the edge, just making sure I fill that void where the other plug is going to connect in, and doing my best to keep it out. You don't want it in the middle of your actual pins here. Don't need to overdo it with this grease, but it does help to have it on there. So there we go. It's all nice around the edges, and when we slide this onto our controller, it's going to provide a nice watertight seal there. All right, so go ahead. We'll grab our controller here, and we'll go ahead and put the big plug onto the big one, all the way till it clicks, and the small one as well, all the way on there till it clicks. Perfect. Now we need to start putting on our phase wire connections. So it was nice we labeled them there before. Green is at the bottom here. So we're just going to make sure we grab the same bolts that we were using that have our lock washer, our flat washer, and it's going to go on here. So we'll go ahead and we'll grab the green one first. Hold this into place. When these go on, they're going to form a bit of a bend this way. So just make sure the long piece of your phase wire extension is headed out the side of the controller that has the extra room on it. That's the way that they're going to all bend when we fold it all in together. So just go ahead and get these on hand tight first. There's green, and we'll go on to yellow in the middle. Now there is a little light underneath the yellow one here. This is the little LED that if you guys are having any sort of error on your controller, this should be blinking. So if you're ever needing support and we're asking you about it, this is the little LED to have a look at there. We'll get this yellow wire put in right on top of there. All right, and the last one is the blue one needs to go up top. So we'll get this blue one all the way up top here. All right, at that point we can grab our wrench and we can tighten these down. So when we get these ready to tighten down with the wrench, make sure that we get them nice and snug, but we don't overdo it. If you guys tighten these too much, you can internally damage the controller, and that'll be the end of the controller. It's not cost effective to get it repaired, so it's gonna have to be replaced. So 15 Newton meters is what the torque spec is on a BAC8000. I believe it's 10 Newton meters on a BAC4000. Snug, but not overly tight. So we have those all in place now. Now we're gonna need to get our positive and negative onto here and make sure that we have this negative that's hanging out here. This is gonna go on top of the negative. We wanna make sure the best connection to the actual controller is the ground, so that's gonna sit on the bottom, and then we're gonna put the negative on here from the harness. As you start adding the rest of these pieces on here, it does get to be a little more difficult to manage everything, so go ahead and get your partner or somebody to help you out if they're around. Makes this job a little bit easier. So what I do is I normally grab that one, I grab this one on top, and then just stick your bolt through here to hold them together, and move your controller up where it needs to go. Once you can get it just started a little bit, you can go ahead and grab your wrench and get it on there the rest of the way. All right, the last one we have to go on is our positive lead here. Get that in place and get this tightened down, and then we'll be ready to mount the controller into place. All right, so we're ready to get this controller all mounted in place now. Everything is tightened down. We've got our connectors on the top. Go ahead and make sure you've got a couple of your screws handy. One thing to keep note of is that if you look at these in your hand, you're going to actually see that you'll have one that's a bit shorter than the rest of them, most likely. That one that's a little bit shorter, we're going to use to put on the side where the phase cables are going to bend, because when this mounts on, we just want to make sure that that bolt's not going to stick through and potentially hit into that phase wire. So you've got a few extra washers in the kit. go ahead and grab one of these Allen screws, put a washer on it for the top. The top has slots in it that are a little wider diameter, so it's best to use these washers. And it gives us a little play to make sure that the rest of the slots can line up. So you should have your 4 mil. Go ahead. Now you're going to need to try to get the harness out of the way so that this controller can be mounted back in here. You may need to push the plugs that you connected that are right near this bracket for your tilt sensor up a little further, just to make sure the top of these plugs that are going in your controller don't conflict with them as they're going in. So get those in a position you're happy with. Check out with your controller how it's going to sit. And once you know it's going to go in there, go ahead and get this first bolt threaded in. Again, easier if you have a bit of a hand with this sometimes, but it is manageable. All right, once you've got one of these in the top, go ahead and put the one in the right side of the bike, making sure that's that one that's a little bit shorter, because this is where these phase cables are going to sit. And you can just go ahead and work this into place. Make sure the other side is appropriately lined up as well. All right, now we know it's going to go in there. And just get this tightened a little bit. Wouldn't go overly tight on any of these until we have them all in place, just so we can keep things moving around a little bit. And we'll grab another one for the top, put a washer on it. So get that other one in the top. Again, just nice and loose until we're ready to tighten everything down. And one more of these over on this side on the bottom here. Should be pretty well lined up by this point with the other 3 in place already. All right, once we get that other side in, we can go ahead and just give these all a nip up tight. Now you're going to see on the new version of the brackets we have in the top here, where I had showed you guys that cutout. With the newest version of this bracket, you guys are going to see those cutouts where we have the clips for the harness up in the top here. Now we've tested this with water ingress and run it under a hose, run it under a faucet. We haven't got any water to go into the controller. If you guys are doing excessive riding in water or very wet areas, you can go ahead and put the silicone there. We're not going to do it now because we're not planning on going anywhere too wet in Perth, Western Australia. So we're just going to leave it as it is now with the dielectric grease and set up like this. All right, now that we've got the controller fully installed down here, we just need to tidy up the wiring and get the top of this mounted back together with the ignition. So just take those screws out that we had in here. Make sure you've got that display connector coming out through the top here, and make sure all of your other wires are nice and pushed into the back of here. Get those in, and we'll get this down into place here and tighten down. Okay, now I've just mounted on the display and the adjuster over here, which is going to do the power modes. Again, you just mount them on your bars, use the rubber inserts as you need, and get them centered over in the middle of your bars. Bring this one over. I normally put it on the inside of the brake lever to make sure there's enough play. Otherwise, this cable can get a little bit too tight. Once you have that hooked together, we're going to be ready to get a battery in here and get this thing fired up and have a look at the programming on it. All right, now we're ready to get the battery put into the bike. So we're just going to go ahead and grab our battery. This is an EBMX 72 volt battery that we're putting into this bike, and get this slid down into place. All right, once we've got the battery nice and down in place, now we're just going to come over, make sure we connect up our display. Now the pins that are inside of this display are very small and easy to damage. There's a small notch that's going to fit into the notch on the female side. Just make sure you're very careful putting these together, or they can get damaged, and we don't want to do that. So line the arrows up, line the notch up, and you'll get your display together. Okay, so we've got our display, we've got that plugged in. Now we're ready to go ahead and turn it on. A little bit of a different operation than the stock bike. We're gonna go ahead and flip the key on, and then we need to hold down on the power button here on this the selector over here. So go ahead and hold the power button down. You'll see the EBMX logo show up, the display turn on. Just like your car, it's gonna turn on. It's sort of gonna run through the cycle and then turn off. Don't touch the throttle while the screen is turning on. Let it do its little warm up. It'll flash 30H in the bottom of the screen. That isn't an error, that's just like your dash lights coming on in your car. Once that clears and the screen looks normal, then you can go ahead and you'll be able to touch the throttle. Just keep that in mind when you're out and riding. You can't flip this on and turn it on quite as quick as you can with a stock bike. Once it is all turned on, now is where we're going to go into a few steps with the EBMX app to make sure that we have our motor controller paired up with our motor, and our motor controller is tuned to work directly with that motor. All the bikes from Sur-Ron come with a little bit of different haul angles, and that really can affect your performance in the bike. So what we've done with the EBMX app is given everybody the ability to run a custom calibration for the hall sensor, as well as the inductance in your motor. So we're gonna jump in, I'm gonna get my phone, and I'm gonna show you guys how to use the EBMX app to get hooked up and get your bike fully set up before you go out on your first ride. Okay, now we're gonna be ready to jump into the EBMX app. So turn on your motor controller and turn on your display on your screen and go in and open up your app. If you're opening for the first time, you're going to need to purchase the app. If you've already purchased it, we should be able to proceed on to hook up to our bike. So once you're here, you can pull down to refresh, and this should pick up the motor controller. So here it is, we've got one bike. It's going to say e-bike, and go ahead and touch on that. This is going to hook up to your motor controller, and we're going to get to this page. We've got a full explanation of how this app works. If you go to the support section of the EBMX website, there's a big manual that's built on that. Bruno has also helped us with a video that explains exactly how this app works. I'm going to show you what's applicable for setting up a new bike once you've put a motor controller into the bike. So the first thing that we're going to do is just go ahead and check the smart setup to make sure everything looks right. As I said, we've got a 72-volt battery, we've got a BAC8000, the max power is 15 kilowatts, the max phase amps is 600, and you guys can go down and adjust your gear ratios to get your speed reading out correctly on your speedo. If you make any changes inside of here, hit apply, and we'll just back out because that's what we need right there. Now, adjustments, you could go into and play with the power and the performance of the bike, but we're just gonna look for calibrating the motor right now. So we're gonna go down into motor tune and throttle calibration. The first one we'll do is throttle calibration. We'll touch throttle. This is going to come up and give you a warning, just telling you make sure your bike is up on a stand. It's always safest to make sure your rear wheel is off the ground whenever you're doing any sort of motor controller tuning. So go ahead, make sure your bike's on a stand, hit agree, and start calibration. So the first step says twist the throttle 100% and hit OK. So I'm going to grab my throttle and I'm going to twist it to 100%. Now I'm going to click OK. I'm going to let my throttle all the way off to 0. I'm going to click OK. And it's going to pick up those values for me. So we've set it at what the stock throttle normally is. It'll pick up exactly where it needs to be. Click apply, flash controller, yes we want to flash, and device flash successfully. So now the throttle is calibrated, and now the last thing we need to do is the inductance test and the calibration of the hall sensor. So this first one we want to do is the inductance test. This is going to measure the resistance that's in our motor with our phase cable extensions and everything. So again, make sure it's up on a stand, agree, read the warnings, and start the calibration. You're going to hear a little beeping, buzzing sort of noise. That'll last for just a second. The rear wheel may do a little bit of a jolt. And now it's going to come up with your new auto-tune values here. So 34 and 4, whereas the value that was in the tune originally was 37 and 4. These are good values. We'll accept those, hit apply, and those have been applied successfully. Now we want to calibrate the offset and the RPM. This is the most important thing to do when you've put a motor controller in, just to make sure that your bike's going to be running optimally. The stock tune is set with an offset angle of -2, which is pretty standard across Sur-Rons. That's our best guess at what yours is going to be, but this is why we want to run this every time. All right, we're going to go ahead, read our warnings here, and we're going to start this test. Just make sure there's nothing near your rear wheel. It's going to spin up. It's going to stop spinning when it's done. This will probably last for 15 to 20 seconds as it does its own calibration. and measures out the RPM. All right, once that's stopped, your app is going to tell you what the auto-tune values are. The important thing to check is that all of the values coming down to here are the same. Your Hall sectors 0 through 7 need to be the same. If they're not, there's potentially something wrong with your Hall sensor. So long as those are all the same, and the Hall offset angle, we had -2. Now this has come back with the actual angle on this bike at -0.52. So it's good we've done the calibration to make sure this is going to run as efficiently as possible, and it's reset our RPM slightly to 6,283. So we're just going to hit apply, and that's applied successfully. Now both of these are applied. Don't close the app yet. You need to back out, and it's going to ask you to flash the controller. This is important. If the controller hasn't flashed, then these settings actually haven't been saved. All right, guys, once we've gotten the calibrations all done, we're pretty much ready to go out and have a ride on the bike. You can use the adjustment section in the app if you want to do any further adjustments, but you're ready. The motor is calibrated, the controller is all tuned, the bike is ready to go, so go out and have some fun, guys.